some American women who lived in the 20th century who had a purpose, and their purpose was entertainment, was notoriety, was fame, was art. Certainly Marilyn Monroe and Lucille Ball are two such women. Lucille Ball was remarkable. You probably know a little less about her. What was so outstanding about her is early in the I Love Lucy show, early in the 1950s, when she and her husband were doing this show for CBS, they decided that the real money, she was the brains here, they decided the real money was not in performance, but was in ownership of the means of production, a capitalist entertainer, if you will. And so she created Desilu Productions, and they owned the shows that they did, and they sold them to CBS. And of course, after these became syndicated and became such an enormous success, she went on to create other programs as well. Now, Marilyn Monroe led a famous and sad life. You probably know quite a bit about her, but it was a life like Lucille Ball's that created the mass culture during the 20th century. And we'll talk about that in a later module. Vivian Maier, I can guarantee that none of you has probably heard of her. She was a remarkable woman who was a nanny, who was an amateur photographer, but who had this artistic gift. And I'll show you a couple of her pictures. What happened after she died was a trunk full of her photographs and unexposed film was available at an auction, and a guy named Maloof, John Maloof, bought it just for no particular reason, and then he discovered her gift. He made a documentary, he licensed her pictures. She had no children, no family, so he is in ownership of that. I want to show you some of these pictures now. This, of course, is a self-portrait she did, and what a remarkable eye she had. Here's a picture she took in September 1959 in New York City. It is realistic, like Ansel Adams, Edward Steichen, other 20th century Americans, Dorothea Lange. She tells such a story. She invites us into the life of this man. We can't tell whether he's been working all day and is eating his lunch or dinner, or whether he's been homeless all day. But it's a tremendous study. And while it is very personalized, it doesn't feel intrusive. And that's part of the remarkable quality of her photographs. For example, these two women walking along the street, I think it's Randolph Street in Chicago. They are dressed well, stylishly, but out of date. Their hair is made up. Their eyeglasses have a certain style. Again, it's probably not the style in 1961. They look a little anxious. They look dependent on each other. And again, Vivian Maier gives us that marvelous, honest look at these two women. Very personal, without apparently being intrusive. Here's another photo she took in fall of 1953 in New York City. Of course, the focus of the picture is a disabled man walking with the crutches. Now, he may have been homeless, looks like he was picked up off the street, and a police officer and another citizen are helping him into this door. Lord knows where that's going to take him. And there is a magnificent indifference in the woman who is walking past the man. There are others who are looking by back toward the man and the little drama, but most are indifferent. This is an insightful picture that Vivian Maier gave us. I encourage you to go to the website and watch the documentary about her and learn a little bit more about this woman who lived with purpose, to tell the story of the world she saw, the lonely world she saw around her. Now, some of the women had remarkable achievement. Sally Ride, of course, PhD, the brunette in the color photograph, was the first American woman in space. Not the first woman in space, that was a Russian woman, but the first American woman. Rosalind Yalow was a Nobel laureate for her work. These women may or may not be known to you, but their purpose was served quietly in their professions with extraordinary exceptionalism. Now, here are two women who did lead famous lives, and they were in the newspapering business. Ida M. Tarbell, shown in the lower left-hand corner, was an investigative journalist who wrote a remarkable scathing study of Standard Oil and its abuses in 1902. Kate Graham, shown in color photo there, was the widow of Phil Graham. She became publisher of the Washington Post at the time of his death. The Washington Post was not nearly the remarkable paper it was at that time of his death. It was essentially a neighborhood newspaper. That is, it told the story of the city of Washington. Under her leadership and that of Ben Bradley, her executive editor, it became one of the world's outstanding newspapers. These two women wanted to take their skills to bring important messages to the rest of the world, and so they did. Here's another photographer. This is Dorothea Lange. She is not shown here. They're pictures that she took. The famous picture on the left is of Florence Owens Thompson. Mrs. Thompson and her children never set out to be famous, but theirs were the faces that represented the Depression, the Dust Bowl, the excruciating suffering that these people had as they got displaced from one to the other. And Dorothea Lange was hired actually by the Works Progress Administration, a federal agency, to record this, to take the history of the time. I hope that somebody is recording the history of our time right now. The next picture there is a World War I veteran, a U.S. citizen of Japanese birth, who is being sent to a relocation camp. There are about 124,000 Japanese Americans, fully American citizens, who were taken because some in America were afraid that they might become saboteurs. They never were. And it was a sad, sad moment in American history in the 20th century. But Dorothea Lange, the photojournalist, recorded these stories. And we know so much about the stories because we see the faces of the subjects. Here are women again in the arts. Maria Tall Chief, an Osage tribe member of First Nations people, was a prima ballerina who was the first to dance, the first American to dance with the Paris and Bolshoi ballets. An elegant, extraordinary woman who was at the very height of her powers as a dancer. And then, of course, Marian Anderson. I will tell the story briefly. Marian Anderson, the great soprano, was scheduled to give a performance in Constitution Hall. Constitution Hall in Washington was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And in 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow the promoter to stage Marian Anderson because she was a Negro, as the language went in the time. Mrs. Roosevelt herself, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, a member of the DAR, was so incensed that she publicly left the membership of the DAR, and she made arrangements for Marian Anderson to give her concert on Easter Sunday in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And there were 75,000 Americans who came to hear the great Marian Anderson sing. If you go to YouTube, you'll be able to hear some of that in the newsreels of that day. Marian Anderson was introduced by Harold Ickes. Harold Ickes was the Secretary of the Interior for the Roosevelt administration. There were other members of the administration. The President nor the First Lady did not attend, but it was clear that they gave their sanction to this by making these arrangements and by having these cabinet members introduce her. These are three women. Betty Friedan in the upper left-hand corner with the hat, Gloria Steinem on the left with the big glasses, and Helen Gurley Brown on the right. Their cause was womanhood itself, was feminism. Betty Friedan was a woman of great accomplishment, graduated from Smith College, was accepted into a PhD program, decided instead to get married. She got married, had some children, and she continued to write for magazines, a very gifted writer. And then in 1962, her book, The Feminine Mystique, was issued. And the book basically asks the question, if a woman has all these gifts of brilliance and intelligence and everything else, is there no place for her in the workplace? Is there no place for her in careers? And The Feminine Mystique was essentially one of the books that started the modern era of feminism in America. Now, Gloria Steinem down in the left-hand corner was also a writer, and she wrote many articles, some first-person articles, about the women's movement. She created Ms. Magazine many years ago. She, of the three, is the only one who survives, and I think Gloria's about 80 years old now. Helen Gurley Brown was the publisher of Cosmopolitan magazine, and she too concentrated on womanhood and on sexual expression and on women's liberties and on a whole variety of topics that were in themselves complementary to the work of Friedan and Steinem. Now, some of you may completely reject the principles and the ideas these women had, and you're free to do so. Just know that for generations of women, these pioneers had a purpose. Here are two political women. In the upper right-hand corner is Phyllis Schlafly, who died not long ago at nearly 100 years of age. There is actually a syndicated cable television show, I think it's called Mrs. America, that tells the story of Phyllis Schlafly. Now, maybe not accurately enough, but in 1964, when Barry Goldwater was nominated as a conservative candidate for the Republican Party for president, Phyllis Schlafly self-published this book and distributed it to all the delegates at the convention. I think the title of the book was A Choice, Not an Echo. And she really defined modern conservatism for a generation. She later created what was called the Eagle Forum, and she was a very prominent Republican woman for many, many years on the conservative side. Now, as far to the right as Phyllis Schlafly was, Shirley Chisholm, who was elected, first African-American elected to the U.S. House from New York, she was a candidate for president. She was nominated in 1972, I think, for president, and of course was not nominated eventually. She was nominated at the convention, but was not the choice of the convention eventually. These two women were contemporaries. They were at the opposite ends of the political spectrum, serving their purpose, telling American women and telling Americans, it is you who must make the choice about whether the government should be right, should be left, should be wrong, should be caring or not. Those are the purposes for which these women lived. Some women served children and families. Jane Addams, pictured in the upper left-hand corner, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. She was the organizer of the Settlement House movement in Chicago. She had the Hull House. I took my PhD studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago on the west side. And in fact, as I parked my car and walked to class each night, I walked right past the memorial that is left of the Hull House there. And so I was reminded of Jane Addams every time. Miss Juliet Gordon Low was the founder of the Girl Scouts of the USA, 1912, Savannah, Georgia. I've been to her home as well in Savannah. And these are women who saw themselves as sparks for larger movements. They encouraged other women to take up leadership roles and to have an effect for the better. And that's what they did. Now here's another woman you may have heard of if you've ever watched Leave It to Beaver on reruns on Family Television Network. June Cleaver, as played by Barbara Billingsley here between 1957 and 63, was the idealized mother in America. And she was not a cartoon, but she was dramatized. She was representative in the minds of the scriptwriters and in the minds of a lot of Americans. Why can't mom be more like June Cleaver? June Cleaver stayed at home. She was happy making meals for the boys, buying their clothes, watching their little adventures, waiting for Ward, her husband, to get home. So in this period, there was a struggle. Remember 1962 is when Betty Friedan comes out with The Feminine Mystique, and June Cleaver is dusting in the living room, waiting for Ward to get home. So you can see the struggle as it began to develop between these imaginary mothers, June Cleaver and others, and the real mothers who worked every night and every day. Now, the question is this: did these women accomplish all their purposes in the 20th century? Well, the March of Dimes, represented by this young girl with polio and with braces, was successful. They developed 2 vaccines, both Salk's and Sabin's vaccine. And these women moved from polio to birth defects, and they continued their advocacy. This child had polio. Now few children in America have polio, thanks to the work of a movement, the March of Dimes, principally led by women. Now the question I ask: could women have done as well as this cabinet meeting of Woodrow Wilson? Or we look at 1994 election for the House of Representatives, and this is Newt Gingrich in the picture with his contract with America. And as you look at the picture, you see all the men seem to be white, and they all seem to be men. And that is sort of a question that we ask ourselves. Is there a barrier? Is there something unsuitable or unseemly about women in politics? Women who lived with purpose. These are who they were, and the changes they made in America, for which all of us have been beneficiaries. And now, of course, the question is, how do the women of today see these causes, and how do they take up their lives with purpose?